Oftentimes, when we think of architecture, we picture beauty, creativity, or self expression, intricate details and domes, beautiful colors. However, the Soviet Union had a different idea. Architecture wasn't primarily about any of that, it was about ideology. By the Google definition, Brutalism is a mid-20th century architectural style known for its massive monolithic forms, raw exposed materials, especially concrete, and utilitarian focus originating from post-war needs for honest, functional buildings. These massive concrete buildings, defined by their massive and geometrical characteristics, were often labeled as cold and ugly, but this was not an accident. They were completely deliberate and a tool of power. They reflected a society shaped by communism and economic scarcity after a time of war. This architecture style carried the belief that the collective mattered more than the individual. When looking at Soviet brutalist architecture, it forces us to ask an important question. What happens when buildings are not designed to express individuality, but to enforce social and political values? In this video, I will argue that Soviet brutalism architecture demonstrates how economic constraint, collectivist values, and political ideology were used to suppress individual expression while producing a powerful and utilitarian aesthetic that shaped how people experienced daily life, space, and identity. In order to understand brutalist architecture, you have to understand the Soviet hive mind. The Soviet Union was a communist state who drew its principles from Marxist and Leninist principles. These principles rejected individualism and private ownership as well as the bourgeois excess. They viewed art and architecture not as a personal and individual endeavor, but as tools of the state. To them, architecture was a visual language of power. Brutalist architecture emphasizes monumentality. This includes massive scale, heavy forms, and sharp angles made with raw concrete. All ornamentation was stripped away because decoration was seen as unnecessary and oftentimes immoral. The priority of this style of architecture was function and efficiency as well as ideological clarity. These structures weren't meant to be cuddling or welcoming. Their purpose was to be commanding, imposing, and dominant. It was used as a reminder that the state was larger than any single life within it, as an individual person was visually dwarfed by these structures. In this way, architecture didn't just mirror communist values, but it rigorously reinforced them. Ideology alone didn't shape this architectural style. Reality had a big part to play. After World War II, the Soviet Union faced severe destruction. There were housing shortages and limited resources. There was an urgent need to house millions of people, cheaply and quickly. Concrete became the material of choice because of its affordability, durability, and efficiency. Reusing prefabricated panels allowed them to assemble buildings quickly. This led to repeated or even identical designs across different cities. Creativity was not eliminated, as you needed imagination to reuse these materials differently and creatively. So creativity was redirected. Architects were working within a very strict margin. Due to these strict constraints, they prioritized the speed and function of a building over its comfort and beauty, which is important to understand. They were not careless or lazy when making these buildings. They were responding to the scarcity caused by the war's aftermath. The harshness and cold aesthetic of these buildings were a direct reflection of the harsh conditions and cold reality they were facing post-war. This was an aesthetic born from necessity, and it valued endurance and function over beauty and elegance. These buildings did not just exist as political representations of a collective ideology. People lived inside them. These buildings emphasized collective living. The apartments were small, repetitive, and uniform. Everything was a shared space, from the hallways to the stairwells, designed to minimize privacy, creating an environment for conformity to grow. This environment shaped people's behavior. When all apartments look the same, individuality starts to follow suit. Over time, this conditioned how people interacted and how they saw themselves. Many people experienced feelings of alienation and emotional distance from their surroundings. When things lack purposeful beauty, we tend to detach from them. The size of the architecture made people feel small and distant from their surroundings. This uniformity erased personal identity. This is when architecture became psychological. It disciplined the body and the mind to mimic it. Today, Soviet brutalist architecture is often dismissed as ugly, unthoughtful, and oppressive, especially when you look at it from the Western perspective, where individualism is highly encouraged and decoration is a crucial part of its architecture. However, this judgment ignores a bigger context. These buildings tell the story of not only control, but survival and collective ideology, as well as social organization. They represent a moment in history where architecture was used as a political weapon. In recent times, brutalism has been re-evaluated. People like me see its beauty and how straightforward it is. It doesn't pretend to be anything that it isn't. They wanted to be authoritarian, so the architecture is authoritarian. They wanted to portray power, so the architecture was powerful. Rightfully, situations such as this makes us question if architecture as well as art, born from control and authoritative power systems, hold any artistic or cultural value. Soviet brutalist architecture is more than geometrical concrete. It is a physical record of the collective identity ideology and how people respond to scarcity. It shows how architecture can function as a tool of power by shaping not only cities, but human psychology. Finally, these buildings force us to ask a often uncomfortable question. Do we shape the spaces we live in, or do they shape us? Does art take after reality, or vice versa? The first time I came upon this architectural style, I was looking at pictures of it on Pinterest. Before I knew or understood its political and historical context, I really enjoyed it for exactly what it was: structural and cold. I think you could even say that before the harshness of the war affected the look of this architectural style, the weather of its location had an earlier impact. When I looked at it, I felt the cold and the harshness, but I enjoyed it. I think it is safe to say that one of the reasons why people hated this style were actually the same reasons why I initially liked it. I also think it is important to take into consideration the fact that the Soviet Union wasn't very popular, and the historical and political connotations that come with this style are a big reason why people react to it the way they did. When viewed in isolation, this style cannot be stripped of its artistic value because it shows the importance of working within your limits and being creative within those limits. It shows that if you know how to work with scarce materials, what you can do building upon that foundation can be powerful. I like to incorporate styles such as brutalism into my art, at least in the beginning stages, because it acts as a building block. Ultimately, brutalist architecture reminds me that limitation doesn't necessarily erase creativity, it reshapes it. Even under restriction, design can still communicate powerful things. It can communicate feeling, meaning, and strength. These buildings prove that art doesn't always come from freedom alone, but sometimes from learning how to create within what you're given. And as unpopular as the Soviets are, we can learn a thing or few from creation with restraints.